I know I'm a border girl. I know what's happening. I've seen the deterioration that has happened in 20 years. And if we don't do everything we can to stop it, where are we going to be 20 years from now? Today in Mexico, there is not a person that has not been affected by cartel violence, that doesn't know somebody who's been murdered, kidnapped, or disappeared. 20 years from now, there will not be an American citizen who doesn't know somebody who died of a fentanyl poisoning, that knows somebody who's been human trafficked, that knows somebody that has been affected in one way or another by what the cartels are doing. This is the biggest threat facing both our countries today.
The opinions of the guests and host are their own and do not represent the opinions of Ironclad, the Border Patrol, or the Department of Homeland Security.
We cut through the partisan talking points. We're not interested in perpetuating fear. We're interested in seeking truth, hearing what's really going on America's borderland. Welcome to Borderland, an Ironclad original. I'm your host, Vincent Vargas, and our next guest is Adriana Jones, who shares a heartbreaking story about her family being massacred in November of 2019 in Mexico. She shares with us their story as well as the nonprofit she started after to hopefully help with change in Mexico against corruption of cartels. I heard about this story while living in Salt Lake City. I have a background in military law enforcement, and right away my circle of friends were calling and saying, what is this about? And since my background was a border patrol agent, I usually get the calls that anything happens in Mexico, people ask me questions. This was a very, very confusing situation for me because I've never heard anything similar to this. There's a lot of chaos sometimes in Mexico. There's all kinds of cartel situations where they're killing innocent people, but we haven't seen a situation where such a close connection to American citizens and United States of America, in this, I guess, this situation. And so also living in Salt Lake at the time, it was even closer to the church that a lot of my friends were associated with. And so it became a very hot topic in my circle of friends. And for those who are listening and watching who probably don't know, would you, and I know you tell your story often, and I know it's not easy. So if you wouldn't mind giving our audience just from the beginning, when you initially heard the call and exactly what happened.
So on November 4th of 2019, I'm going to tell you the story of what happened before I tell you where I was, because it is such a convoluted story. It's kind of hard to get the story right because there were multiple people, multiple vehicles. So two cartels had a shootout the night before in a town called Agua Prieta. It's a border town down in Mexico. All this we know now. Obviously, we didn't know at the time. At the time, we had no idea what happened and what was going on. And they were told, these two rival cartels, their orders were to calentar plaza, is the way it's said in Spanish, right? Which means to heat up the scenario because it brings kind of police and government pressure on the opposing cartel, right? If you kind of heat up their territory a little bit. And so their orders were do whatever it took, make sure that situation, that area that they were fighting over had a maximum impact or whatever, right? So they were having shootouts. But a lot of misunderstanding is this idea that my sister was somehow caught in the middle of a shootout. They were massacred a mile from their home. They were leaving. It was 10:30 in the morning when I got the news. So this wasn't in the middle of the night, and it wasn't as remote of a place as you think. Yes, it is a remote road in Mexico, but it's their remote road in Mexico. You know what I mean? It's this is a passage that they go daily. People from those towns drive those roads. Like that's how they get to the nearest grocery store. They live on this kind of like a homestead, a Mormon homestead in Sonora. I'm not from La Mora, where the massacre took place. I'm from another Mormon colony that's in the neighboring state, Chihuahua. It's like 3.5 hours from there. So I had never actually been to that area. But it's they've got 50 homes there. It's not small, and then they have another town right there, they're neighbors, so it's not so remote. So leading up to the events, there had been like a couple, the violence had seemed to be escalating between the cartels with previously with 6 months, let's call it, to a year. So they'd had a little bit more interactions where they'd been stopped by cartels and things like that. And I know this sounds like, how did anybody leave their house? Wasn't it instantly martial law? Well, that's kind of the way things are in Mexico now. So being stopped by military or cartel with big guns or things like that is what's happening in Mexico. So it wasn't the most insane thing, even though it seems like it now in hindsight. But the violence had been escalating. So because of that, these three women that all had different places they needed to be decided to kind of drive out together, you know, to kind of caravan, so to speak, through this mountain pass that you kind of lose service at the top of it before you get down into the bigger town. My sister's vehicle had broken down. So one of the other mothers, women that had been murdered, drove her back, but didn't want to wait for her. And the other woman took off ahead, was like, I'm not waiting for you guys, not worth it. It's like, you know, this is their own, they've been on this road 1,000 times. They weren't that stressed, a little bit, but not that stressed. So my sister borrows her mother-in-law's vehicle, doesn't wait, tells her brother-in-law, you need to go get my car, it's broken down, doesn't wait for him. She leaves in her mother-in-law's vehicle, unloads all her stuff, her kids. She had her my 12-year-old nephew, my 10-year-old niece, and her twins with her. So imagine she's got all this luggage, she's unloading in the middle of this like road that she broke down on and took off. So when her brother-in-law shows up to pick up this broken down vehicle to see what happened to the wheel, right? He's kind of working on the tire, and all of a sudden he looks up and he sees like black smoke, like black smoke, and he thinks that's so weird. Like, is someone's car on fire? You know, what's going on up there? And so he drives up almost to offer help to whoever's having, you know, issues with the vehicle up there. And when he pulls up to the site, like I said, it's about a mile from their like houses and hometown. He recognizes his mother's vehicle, and it's all shot up and it's on fire. And at this point, the blaze is so big that he can't even get close enough to see if they are inside or not. Like the fire's too strong. He sees men dressed in military fatigues, you know, like military style, running down the side of the mountain, and kind of gets scared, doesn't know what's going on, and goes back home for help. So when they all gather together, you know, a bunch of men to go see what's happening, what happened to the vehicle. By the time they get back up there, they'd even sent drones up there. I mean, at this point, they're afraid. Like, you're in Mexico, you are the first responders, but they're afraid. They don't know what's going on. So they had drones go up there. They see the vehicle on fire. They don't see anybody around it. So they drive up, and I don't know if you watched the video of Kenny Miller where he says, you know, it's on YouTube and stuff, you know, this is for the record. Anita and 4 of my grandchildren have been burnt. And that's when we got the news that their bodies, that they had been in the vehicle, you know, and that they had been shot up and burned. So at this point, they don't know, nobody knows what has happened to the other 2 women and their children. I got the news at 10:30. The entire country got the news around 10:30. Like, everybody knew what was happening. I was on Victoria Island up in Canada on an anniversary trip. And at first, when I got the news, I thought the vehicle shot up. This first thing that came through, you WhatsApps, like everybody has a family WhatsApp. So the second someone posts something, it just spreads like fire. So the first news that I received was something had happened to Nita. The vehicle had been shot up. That's it. So in my mind, I'm like praying like with God that, you know, that they're okay, that they're probably been kidnapped at this point. You know, I'm thinking of my sister, and I'm thinking of poor little Crystal, and I'm thinking like rape, and those are the things that are going through my mind, like that they've been kidnapped.
Things that we've heard to be common practice, kind of in that. Yeah.
So at that point, that's what I'm thinking. And we're trying to get back, because you kind of have to take seaplanes off of Victoria. And there'd been fog that morning that it held us back. So we're trying to figure out, we're kind of just in shock and walking back to see if we can get off the island. And my husband, Dustin, just walked like, I don't know, 10 feet further in front of me. Like, I don't know, he must have had a feeling, you know? and he's listening to the WhatsApps that are coming through, and he just turns around and he tells me, babe, they're all gone. They're all burned. They're just all gone. And I just fell to the ground. I was sobbing. I just was so like, it just seems so impossible, right? Just still seems so impossible, this story. Like, I feel like I'm living in a different time, in a different world. As things progress, like I said, at this point, you're in so much shock, you don't quite, know what to do. So I was just kind of sitting there in my own thoughts, but Dustin was following what was actually taking place in La Mora, and he sat down and he said, your parents are going up there. He said the police haven't showed up. It's been hours, nobody has shown up, and nobody knows what happened to the other two women, and they're up in the mountain, and nobody will show up and help. And so your family, I think you need to call your dad and tell him not to go. I'm worried about your parents. So I called my dad and I said, Dad, I don't want you to go. I'm so scared. And he said, Mija, I'm going to get my daughter. If you want to pray for me, pray for me. Talk to your mom. And I talked to my mom and I said, Mom, I'm just so worried. And she's like, sweetheart, no one's coming to save us. It's just us. We're going to help, and we're going to go find those other moms, and we're going to go see what's happening. And my parents were about 3.5 hours from La Mora. They weren't right next door. So them and a whole group of like, my mom was the only female, but a group of like probably I'm gonna say 30 men, I don't know how many, took off from my hometown to go offer aid, right? Assistance to see what was happening. They were stopped at multiple military stops along the way, which we now believe was on purpose to give the cartel a chance to get away. When they're arriving, when they get to that first town before you head up to the mountain pass, they actually meet up with Donna's husband, David. Donna was one of the other women that was murdered that day, along with her two boys. She had 9 children in her vehicle, and 7 survived, and the other 2 were murdered.
Could you clarify for me? So several vehicles were shot up in the same.
Yeah, so at this point, we don't know that yet of the story. We're just, at this point, Nita was no. So we still don't know what had happened to those other 2 women. But at the end, both women were murdered, and 2 more children were murdered, and the other survivors were shot up.
And
But
was this separate locations or one location?
location. So that's what people get confused, because Christina had taken off up the mountain pass. We now believe she was actually murdered first, and she was in her vehicle with her baby Faith in a car seat, just 2. She actually got out of the vehicle as a woman, put her arms up, and they shot her anyways. When so Donna's ahead of Nita, right? Because she dropped her off, and she was ahead of my sister Nita. When she gets up to the pace, but it's more like 5 miles, I think, away. So she was miles ahead of Nina, now up in that mountain pass a little more. So when she arrives, they actually see Christina's body on the ground and started trying to reverse. And that's when the whole vehicle just gets shot up. And 2 boys and Donna were murdered. I think 1 or 2 of the kids actually were not injured. And then the other ones were all shot up from gunshot wounds to their chest. Their whole faces were shot up, arms, legs. And they actually were left up in that mountain with no government showing up. When my mom, I believe it was about 8 o'clock at night, when my mom, that caravan coming from my hometown that had met up with Donna's husband, David, that was coming down from the Phoenix, Tucson area, showed up. And that's when they actually first found out that baby Faith had survived, because nobody even knew she was alive in the other vehicle. She had 2 bullets in her car seat. And those children, at first they tried to walk home all together, but they were all so shot up that they ended up having Devin, who was 14, I believe at the time, walk home. And he said he at points was being shot at. It took him all day to get back to the town to tell them that his mom and Christina were dead, that the 2 boys were dead, and that his siblings were hiding up in the mountains, shot up.
Oh my goodness.
Oh, it's awful. It's
Oh,
crazy stories.
and those kids, I
But
couldn't
when I
imagine.
testimony, I mean, they said that when they were trying to walk, right? They was like, well, how did you do that? And they said, well, we had my little brother on a pillow, kind of holding his face up, and we would walk, and then like 20 feet, and we'd set him down on the road, and then we'd go back for the other baby that was shot up, and then we'd walk 40 feet, and then we'd walk back. And imagine they have to set these kids down, and they're also all shot up. Like their survival story is insane, honestly. And the first thing every one of them said was, we have to go back. We have to go back for the others, you know? It's just, so Devin says that they just knew they weren't getting anywhere, right? So they decided to kind of hide out and let just one of them go because it was taking too long. And they were afraid too. I mean, all these cartels all around them, gunshots all around them. And so when they ended up, Devin ended up taking so long that they ended up sending the 9-year-old who was shot in her arm, and she ended up getting lost. And they didn't find her. She was the last one to be found because she had taken like the wrong little road trying to find a way home. But we're talking 9:30 at night, this little 9-year-old out there trying to get
Did she
home.
pass away?
No, she survived. She's a survivor. First thing she said, it's pitch black outside. I don't think 9:30, 10 o'clock by then. And they said that she had taken the lights. It was cute. Her dad was the one when he was on the scene. And so my mom was sitting next to her dad, and she said, so first they come across this scene, and it's the first time, like, so at this moment they had gotten a call that they were dead because Devin had made his way home. So they didn't know they were showing up to bodies. So when they show up along this mountain pass, and that's when they discover baby Faith alive, he's just there with his wife, right? His wife's body and his 2 boys, right? And the other kids are gone. Well, but the kids had been picked up by other people coming up from the other side. Well, all of a sudden somebody ran up to him and told him that the Mackenzie was missing, that she was lost, that nobody knew where she was. And my mom said it was instant. It went from like the most guttural grief of a dad to, my gosh, I still have a daughter I need to save. Somewhere in these crazy mountains, I have to go find this daughter, you know? And it just like switched mode. She said it was crazy, but he was the one that said, well, you can see the lights to Bavispe, but you can't see the lights of La Mora. So she probably went to Bavispe. And that's where they found her. She had thrown her shoe at a rattlesnake along the route. So she was one shoe on, one shoe off. And she was just walking down the road heading towards this town. And first thing she said, I'm telling you, freezing night. And she said, we just have to go back. We have to go back up there. We have to go find the other kids. My brothers and sisters are up there. And they told her, no, they're okay. We got them now, sweetheart. We got them, you know. And they were all rushed. Honestly, it's like, yeah, it's a crazy story. It's still beyond words. Like I said, it feels like you're all the war.
It's something I think us in the US have not heard in full detail. What I originally got from it was just almost like an ambush of a caravan. The vehicles driving together and getting ambushed. And then the talks of why and what happened. There was conversations of maybe the family was involved in drugs and the cartel was upset. Things like that were all being passed around just through the network of just kind of the hearsay.
One of the, when you started, you mentioned something like, well, you know, we haven't heard about an American family or like this because, well, like in my work, one of the things that I really want people to understand is that this exactly is happening to families all over Mexico. They're not American citizens, so it doesn't make the news. But it is not just civil war among the cartels. It's not just cartel involved people being murdered every day. It is families. It is people just working. It is people selling stuff on the streets. It is people just out at the plazas. It is people are being caught up in these wars every single day. It's not, and the first thing they want to do is tell you they're involved, right? Because it makes it easy.
Right.
We were told by the first person that came to investigate that ended up, it's actually a sad story. He's actually been murdered now because he was one of the good guys. He was sent as an investigator to investigate the case, right, from the government. And they were said, well, see if you can find any dirt on them. That'll make it all go away. You know, and they couldn't.
Yeah.
There's not.
Have you guys been able to identify exactly which cartel was involved in this and why they even did it?
It's so much more complicated than just that straightforward. So at the time of the massacre, For sure the Sinaloa cartel, but as you I'm sure know now, the Sinaloa cartel is fractured. So Mayo Zambada's side is actually the side that's more connected with the case, and they have those people. La Línea falls under the Juarez cartel, right? And they were for sure involved. But Gente Nueva, which I believe is part of the Sinaloa cartel, were there helping La Línea that day. And then Tolteca, which is one of the people arrested, had been previously with Sinaloa, then with La Línea, and now again, right? So it's like, so those fractures that are happening right now within the cartels were happening at that time. And so, I mean, they betray each other all the time, join different sides, but there are all these groups, right? These small factions that end up working with the different cartels. And so, but for sure, those four are named, and the people that have been arrested fall in line with those working with those different cartels.
And the reasons you said is just because they wanted to bring heat on the area, and they thought the best decision to make was to attack the church, some of the people from the church.
I don't believe that this was, I mean, it could have been, let's attack these güeritos that live here, these little white people that live here. You know, I don't think it was against the church at all. It might have been against American citizens because it obviously raises the profile of the heat that you're creating by making them American citizens. So it wasn't church involved at all. So there's that possibility. There's the possibility that they didn't care who it was and they were there that day, right? Because they didn't go into their town, right? They shot them for traveling. So one of the things that we have pushed the very most for as a nonprofit is the concept of having Mexico designate cartels as domestic terrorists and the US designate cartels as international terrorists. And the reason is we need people to understand that to calentar plaza is terrorism. If you're showing up just to heat up and you don't care who you murder and you're just trying to gain control and scare everybody into doing what you say and taking over a territory, it's like that's the definition of terrorism. It's not like you're against the one cartel or you're coming out for that one person who did you wrong. It's not like, you know, it is actually terrorizing an entire area, a city, a town, a people, right?
Yeah.
Like the impact that they have. Why did they do that? To gain control of the area, right? Why was the Taliban? Why does Bin Laden bomb?
Yeah.
You know, why do they do it? Well, it gives them control. Everybody's afraid. You know, if you go into these places, like nobody's going to say what you did. Nobody's going to talk about you. Nobody's going to, you know, you just have free reign if there's enough terror in the area.
So I want to talk about your nonprofit, but I want to real quick, if you don't mind first, giving us a history lesson on how come the church has these factions in Mexico, and how big is that? Is this a pretty big group of LDS or Mormons in those areas?
So Mormons in Mexico date back to the 1800s. Like the first Mormon colonies down there pre-Revolutionary War, pre-Pancho Villa, right? And then when all the Revolutionary War happened and stuff, a lot of them came home. So some of them are like ghost towns, and then a lot of them went back, right? So you have your traditional LDS church, and there's straight LDS Mormon colonies there, right? That have the temple and the full LDS. And then you have all the breakoffs. And if you know anything about Mormons and fundamentalist Mormons and different Mormons, there's not 10. There are hundreds of Mormon breakoffs, like hundreds, right? So La Mora is a Mormon breakoff. And my hometown, LeBaron, is a Mormon breakoff, fundamentalist Mormon breakoff. So, but they're not even the same one. They're not, you know, they don't follow the same prophet and they didn't follow the same path. They're separate breakoffs. But because they're Mormon breakoffs and they're Americans living in Mexico, they have gotten to know each other and intermarried and stuff. So there's a lot of family connection between the two, but they're separate breakoffs from the LDS church. That makes sense?
Yeah, no, I completely understand. And so they've been in Mexico for so long. They've been kind of inundated.
I have it's 5 generations.
Right. And so like the families have seen the cartels and the violence that they've had, and they've never had any issues with the cartel like directly like this, or is this just one story of several others that's happened in the past?
So growing up, because I was born in Mexico, but I grew up kind of like, I joke I'm a border brat, right? So I grew up kind of bouncing back and forth from the US and Mexico my whole life, right? So, growing up in Mexico when I was a child, so I'm 40 now, like everybody knew who a mafioso was, right? That meant you sold drugs, because you could tell because the house was prettier than all the other houses in Mexico. It's a little bit extra bougie, like don't see those houses unless, they're into drugs, right? That was kind of, but just going through the towns and stuff. But the concept of a sicario, a hitman, no, like violence on that level, no. Like not in the world I grew up in. Any of the states along the border are, just obviously there's drug money going through there, but not like what you're seeing today. So in my research, and I would say in my own personal story, around 2008, the violence really, really started escalating between the cartels. So in our community, the first time we were ever really touched, but it started getting a little bit bad. Like the main grocery store that I grew up with my whole life. I knew the family my entire life. You could walk to it, but it's the only one in the whole town. They up and left from one day to the next, the whole family. They were just being extortion too much. Like they took off to the US. So those little things like that, right? Where you just started hearing all those rumblings and the stuff happening. Well, then I might have the date wrong, but I believe it was 2010 or 2009. My cousin was kidnapped and he had been working up in the sierras, the mountains of Chihuahua. His dad owned a ranch up there, a logging ranch, and he was working and he was kidnapped. And as a community, it was the first time we had like a direct thing happen to us like that in our community. I know in other Mormon towns they'd had other things, but that was ours. And when this happened, I actually happened to be visiting in Mexico at the time. So all the entire town went to the capital. It's like 4 hours from my hometown of Chihuahua City. And we demanded that the government do something. We kind of felt that as kind of a little bit more well-off community that does a lot of, agriculture and ranching and farming and stuff, that we would be targeted if we paid ransom. And so we felt that if we paid the ransom, they were never going to leave us alone, right? That we had to kind of make a stand right then. There's so many children, huge families. So they made a stand that we weren't going to pay the ransom. But we went, when I tell you hundreds from our town showed up to the Capitol, demanded that the government do something. And they ended up releasing my cousin. So his older brother, sorry, go ahead.
No, I think that's interesting, right? That's how kind of connected the government is to the cartel at times, right?
Yeah, whatever strings they pull, they end up just enough social pressure. So his older brother, so my cousin, so Eric it was kidnapped. His oldest brother became an activist after that, kind of hardcore activist, like started something called SOS, like WhatsApps and little groups, searching for help. Just we could kind of see what was happening, that you know, the country, that rule of law in Mexico was deteriorating rapidly. And he ends up, they showed up to his home at night, drug him out of his home. His wife and his 5 boys were at home. His brother-in-law, who lived just next door, ends up coming over to try to help out. So they take his brother-in-law and they drive them down a couple miles and shot them both in the back of the head. So they were,
Oof.
so that was actually the first thing that ever happened to us. And I just shook everyone to be taken from your own house, right?
Yeah.
Just because of his activism and his work, you don't, good guys don't get to survive here. So since that time, right? So now we're 20 years later, right? And Mexico has just been in a free fall of deterioration of rule of law. Like it's just the cartels are more and more brazen every single day. They don't even have to try to pretend, that they're not
Yeah.
doing what they're doing. I think of it, in my opinion, Mexico is being held hostage by the cartels, who are part of an estimated $60 billion a year industry between human trafficking, drugs, fentanyl, indentured servitude. I mean, the border crisis, all the migration, they just profit off of all those migrants. It's insane.
Yeah.
So I feel that my country is very much being held hostage by these cartels.
Absolutely. And tell me about your nonprofit, the organization, and then your initiative that's happening right now.
So Ronita Vive started, we knew after after Nita and the kids were massacred, that we had to do something, but it's like, what do you do? You know, we were talking as a family. There's just no way we were just gonna walk away and act like this didn't happen. We got a lot of pushback. We immediately put petitions in to have them declared terrorists. Immediately pushed back on the Mexican government for the fact that, I mean, the criminal negligence that day, it took 24 hours for somebody to even show up to my sister's bodies. We personally put their burned bodies in their coffins. Like, we personally did everything. The government just was not there and didn't show up to save those children, did not. And they are capable. They chose not to, because in my opinion, collusion with the cartels. And so we had gone in December to like a march for change, right? You know, a march for justice, along with hundreds and hundreds of people all over Mexico. So when we're in this march, people kept walking up to us and hugging us and telling us their stories. So we had an appointment to see the president, López Obrador, at the time, right? And they knew that we were going to meet with him. So people kept giving us like flyers, you know, my handicapped brother, my mom and my dad, and they wanted the ranch. So they went in and murdered all of them. And now they took over all of that territory. My 16-year-old daughter was taken by one of them. I haven't seen her in 5 years. My 17-year-old son was studying. You don't want to get involved. They murdered him. So people were giving us like sometimes handwritten letters, sometimes flyers with photos on them, sometimes this disappeared. And we would go back to the hotel room with like our pockets filled with all these stories of people who had experienced violence in Mexico from the cartels. So that's a little bit where the concept of Ronita Via came from. Was it access to justice for victims of cartel violence and organized crime. And so we have a nonprofit based here in Utah, fully founded in the US. And then we also have the sister nonprofit fully founded under Mexico law in Mexico City. And we do a lot of lobbying. Legislative change is what we're going to be focusing on a lot this year, especially with Trump in office. I think we see there a lot more potential for that. With the terrorism designations and even his pressure on the Mexican government. But even just recognition as victims, we had to fight for 2 years to even be able to attend the trials for my sisters. Because according to Mexican law, you're not recognized as a victim if it's organized crime. It's a crime against society. So you don't have access to those trials. It's just ridiculous, right? And so that's one of our bills that we are presenting to the government that we've been working on to actually, so that every victim has rights, you know, to attend their own trials, to follow their case. Terrorism designation is huge. A lot of anti-corruption, you know, amplified sentencing for police officers and military that join the cartels, just things like that.
You know, you guys have been in place now. Have you seen anything in a positive direction? Have you seen any kind of movement that looks like you might be able to kind of move the needle?
So one of the craziest things to me is, so when we first petitioned to have them declared terrorists, which to me it's the biggest one, because I think the ripple effect of it will have the most lasting change, right? Because it really allows both governments to target the cartels more specifically. So when we first petitioned back all the way in December of 2019, I mean, Mexico wanted to eat us alive. Vende patrias, right? We went and asked another country for aid. You know, like, you sold your country, right? You're anti-Mexico. Today, the common theme is, if wanting help from what the cartels are doing to our country makes us a traitor, and this is all of Mexico speaking, then put me in jail, because we are not dying, they are killing us. These terrorists are killing us. Since we made those petitions, there is not a cartel incident where the conversation about, well, of course they're terrorists, but what does that mean on a political front? We actually changed the entire dialogue of how people are approaching this and how they are looking at it. So I do think, even though we haven't gotten like the legislative change written into law yet, these 5 years have really changed the way people see it. And really approach the cartels, because it is true. The damage they do is beyond just the murder, the ripple effect in society. I mean, you don't even want to, why are you going to own a store if they're going to come in, if the extortion is so high? Now you're noticed. Now you're a target. Now they're going to show up with guns and, you know, and when you say, I don't want to get involved, cartels are like, well, that's cute. We know where you live. We know where your kids go to school. You sure you can take the money or not, but you're going to do what we tell you either way.
The-
You know?
They say the plato y plomo, right?
So it's like there's a lot of corruption in Mexico and a lot of bad people, but the majority are being held hostage. They have to. They will be murdered and their kids will be murdered, and it's been happening. It happens every day. Every time there were more people running for office murdered in this last election than any other time in history. Like if you're a good guy, you're not going to last long. It's just it's awful. And so just I really think that we've made a huge leap in changing that conversation and changing the psychology about the cartels and the damage they're doing to the country on both sides of the border. Because then you have this fentanyl epidemic going on in the US, the same migration crisis that's happening, right? So desplazamiento forzado means forced displacement. So it means all the people running away from their ghost hometowns because the cartels have absolutely taken over. So you have all these migrants that would love to stay home, right? But they can't. The violence is too crazy up in these small towns all over Mexico. You have absolute backpacks of fentanyl crossing the border in these migrant groups. One backpack is enough to kill an entire state. It's
Yeah.
just, the crisis is so big, we've gotten to the point where it can't be ignored anymore on either side of the border, in my opinion. And so we've made
Yeah,
a movement on those fronts. Like,
absolutely. I love to hear that. When you said the saying that the kind of the unified front in Mexico that they're willing to stand against cartel, put me in jail if not right. Like if standing against it and put me in jail, that was a very strong message. And if that's a unified choice, I feel like it means that there should be this almost a wave of change coming. Almost like the wave of change is coming, that ripple effect of that. Um, is there a concern for you, for people like you, just like your older cousin, for a cartel to come after your family directly because of one more
um,
time?
110%. My dad has become a full-time activist. Um, but he says, well, they were going to come after me if I put one of them in jail. So if they're going to come after me anyways, at least the world knows what's happening and knows what's going on, because I can't pretend it didn't happen. And the only way to not become a target for them is to pretend it never happened. And I refuse to pretend that my daughter and my 4 grandchildren weren't burned 1 mile from their home. So if that makes me a target, it makes me a target. At least the world knows what's going on.
Does the church, I know the rules are different in Mexico. I know in Utah, a lot of my friends who are LDS or part of the church are also avid gun trainers. We train a lot with those guys. They shoot, they train, there's home defense. I mean, you name it. The LDS community is very good about protecting what's theirs here in America. The gun laws are different in Mexico. What has the church kind of done to kind of solidify protecting themselves in that capacity?
So I wouldn't know, like I said, I'm not from your traditional
Yep.
LDS church. So they're like smaller towns. So they have their own, like, we say, we first responders for sure.
Oh,
But
cool.
gun rights in Mexico don't exist. The right to bear arms does not exist at all. So obviously those who have what they need, it's very private about having what you need and only can be used in the most extreme of circumstances, because you don't have the right. I mean, that was a huge reason why people didn't immediately show up to that scene. They didn't even have the right to.
Yeah.
They don't. So one of the Julian, who's brother to Benjamin, who was murdered, right? So Eric and these brothers, right? So Julian has gone on to become an activist these last, ever since his brother was murdered. And his spiel is usually Mexico has a monopoly on security and the security system is colluding with the cartels. I mean, how are we
Oof.
not, I mean, what are we supposed to do? We don't we don't even get to protect ourselves in this country. And then yeah, in my sister's case, when you go down the list of all the people that have been arrested, so when somebody has an alias, right, and it says coma this, coma that, como Santos, coma dos, como, it means that they were ex-comandantes. That means they were ex-police, they were ex-military. There are so many people arrested with those aliases, I can't even tell you. Like, it's insane. like how many people are colluding. They take their training and then they join the cartels. And so, like I said, this problem is bigger than Mexico can handle. And it is, I mean, a $60 billion a year market from the US. I see this as a regional issue, and it's going to take both countries working full out with the best of their abilities. And they're still very, it's still going to take, everything they've got and then some.
Yeah, I've talked to a lot of people on this show about what are some of the answers that they believe from their expertise and how to, I guess, take the wind out of the cartel's sails. I think the biggest argument is we are the biggest consumers of these products. We are the consumers of the drugs. We're the consumers of the unfortunately the human trafficking trade as well. And so how do we take the fuel away from the cartel? Well, there's something internally here in America that needs to change as well, right? We need to address our own culture and why we're the biggest demand of these commodities that are making the cartel billions of dollars. And it's challenging because, like you said, no matter who it is who tries to be the good guys seem to be getting killed, right? Like good journalists, good activists, good law enforcement. It's an uphill battle, and it's just been the hardest thing. From my position of interviews, it's like, man, where do we start? From your experience, from your family's background and history, where do you think we have to start? From just identifying them as a terrorist, but then what's next?
So, I see this as like, uh, you have to attack it from all angles. It's cancer. We need chemo, honestly. Like that's the way I think it's going to hurt. It's going to be hard. So I do believe that we should absolutely secure that border with every might of our being. And I'm an immigrant, all for immigration, love. But there hasn't been legal immigration reform in decades. It's a joke. Nobody can, make it make sense. You cannot get a visa to save your own life. It takes you years just to work, but you can walk across the border. No, no, no. It should be, you cannot get across that border to save your own life, but you can get a visa that you're responsible and come and work, and that should be easy and should take 6 months, right? And it needs to be the opposite. So I think we need a lot of reform because that'll stop. I think if you have that, okay, now you're affecting their market because it's harder for them, right, to actually do work. I mean, there has been a free for all. They're making so darn much money out of all this migration and the chaos. They can do whatever they want right now. There's like almost no control, right? So I just feel like it's been a free for all for the cartels. I believe Mexico needs to be pressured by, they need to be put in a corner that they basically say, sorry, cartels, like we're put into kind of a corner and forced to work with the DA. They actually, the last administration and this new one actually broke a lot of ties that existed with the US and the work that they were done and a lot of stuff that was effective. And I actually think that they need to reinvigorate all those programs that existed. Like the relationships within the departments are just
Yes.
really, really bad right now. And so I think that almost going back to what was would be a starting point. Obviously, you need to go further than that, but let's just go back to what was working even, 20 years ago, because today it just none of that exists. And I think, they just had a lot more cooperation going into the country and actually doing like, specified cases, where they showed up, operations and stuff like that, which like I said, they've been so estranged that stuff hasn't been going on as much. Fentanyl, all the little fentanyl factories and the precursors in China and all of that work. That's all stuff that the US can pressure Mexico through their agreements to do a better job on. So I really see Trump using his powers that be, right, to pressure the Mexico government to do more. I think that the second you say nobody's crossing this border, you solve a lot of that migration because Mexico has to deal with it too. It's kind of
Yeah.
like you put Mexico in a terrible situation when you're like, oh, people are getting across. Well, every person south of Mexico now has to go through Mexico. And so the second you stop that, you say absolutely not, source immigration, go online from your country. Nobody's coming unless they do that. Like you could really staunch a lot of that is just costing so much money and put all of that money into more of these programs that would actually be effective, in my opinion.
Yeah.
But we need military. Once they're declared terrorists, the two countries need to work together and actually create operations that are effective, in my opinion.
What's scary is who knows how deep the corruption goes in the Mexican government. And so the
Might
hesitation
say
to,
they have to put them in a corner. Oh, so you want your entire economy to collapse? Like maybe we're the scapegoats, right? If we put them in such a corner, be like, sorry, cartel, like I have to do what they're telling me now, or else I'm
yeah,
not in it anymore. Maybe we save them. Maybe they can actually do what they're supposed to do. I don't know. It's for sure going to take mass amount of social pressure and mass amount of government pressure and international pressure. We're eventually going to take our case internationally. It's just,
yeah,
it's never moving past its criminal negligence lawsuit and the Mexican government, but it's not going to move past there. We have to exhaust, legally everything in the country before we can move to the next step. But we understand completely that Mexico isn't going to move without international pressure.
yeah. If you could share one message with the leaders of the United States and Mexico, what would that be?
So I know I'm a border girl. I know what's happening. I've seen the deterioration that has happened in 20 years. And if we don't do everything we can to stop it, where are we going to be 20 years from now? Today in Mexico, there is not a person that has not been affected by cartel violence, that doesn't know somebody who's been murdered, kidnapped, or disappeared. 20 years from now, there will not be an American citizen who doesn't know somebody who died of a fentanyl poisoning, that knows somebody who's been human trafficked, that knows somebody that has been affected in one way or another by what the cartels are doing. This is the biggest threat facing both our countries today, hands down. And if we don't, I get it's impossible, but if we don't do something about it, who's going to? Nobody's coming to save us. It's going to take all of us. It's going to take every citizen to put pressure, and everybody in government to open their eyes, and everybody in both countries to realize that we have to work together. This is not, US can't do it without Mexico. Mexico can't do it without the US.
Beautiful. I love that. Do me one more time, if you don't mind. Tell us about your nonprofit and how people listening to the show can support you and help out.
So my nonprofit is Rhonita VIVE. That means Ronita lives, because my sister's name was Rhonita. And we are access to justice for victims of cartel violence and organized crime. We take on individual cases, help families individually that have been through things like us with legal fees and pro bono stuff. We take on bigger projects where we help entire communities sometimes leave for safety or travel to tell their stories. We also do a lot of legislative lobbying to try to get the changes that we see that matter most. And yeah, you can find us everywhere. We're on Instagram, we're on Facebook, we have a website, just ronitaviva.com. All the support means the world to us, anything you guys can do.
Adriana, thank you so much for sharing your story. Powerful, sad, heartbreaking, but also to see what you guys are doing to try and help is incredible. Like I said before, anything you need from us, we're supporting. So likes and shares, whatever it is you need from us. And if there's anything I can help on my personal side of my background, don't hesitate to ask.
For sure. I hope we have a long, effective relationship with, I imagine it'll be needed in the future.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much.
So much. It was a pleasure, Vince. I appreciate it.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Take care. Thank you for listening to Borderland and Ironclad Original. Please don't forget to share and tell your friends, as well as if there's a subject or something that you want us to address on the show, let us know in the comments. Okay, take care.